our director's office, that actually, when I first started 15 years ago with the department, our communications and outreach and information education was actually in our services division. And now it's in the director's office, and our acting supervisor is Rebecca, who introduced herself earlier. And I'm just going to try to keep pointing out names for you just to try to help out. Did you raise your hand, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Oh, Rebecca's not here, so don't worry about that. And our legal services, David spends a lot of time both in his office downtown, but also at the Game and Fish office, our headquarters. And we have our Habitat Protection Program. Our Habitat Protection Program, which is supervised by a supervisor of that program, and Scott Smith in the director's office, a large program that works on all of our environmental compliance and project evaluation work that we do, oil and gas leasing. They're spending a lot of time on migration corridors right now. A very busy and a very important, and at times working on complex and contentious issues for sure. Underneath Scott and I and the director, we have our four main divisions: our fiscal, services, fish, and wildlife. Greg Phipps, our fiscal division chief, introduced himself, as did Dee Dee, who's the chief of our services. There's Rebecca. I introduced you again, Rebecca. Dee Dee's the chief of our services division. Alan Osterland's our chief of our fish division. And Scott Edberg is our acting chief of our wildlife division right now. So you see the administration of all of our divisions, all of our division administrators are here today. That's our agency staff. They will be at every commission meeting. So our chiefs and those divisions that have deputy chiefs are here today, and they will be at most commission meetings. And they are responsible for administering those programs, which includes not just the Cheyenne HQ, but working with the regional programs as well. So our mission, as you know, straightforward: conserving wildlife and serving people. We already covered some of this, so I'm going to go through it kind of quick. This is a statutory definition of our responsibilities to provide an adequate and flexible system for control, propagation, management, regulation, protection of all Wyoming wildlife. And I guess of this, if there's anything you take away from this slide, it's the word all. We're not just responsible for managing the big game that we spend a lot of time in the season setting process. We're responsible for managing all wildlife in Wyoming. So you'll find we have a robust non-game program. We spend considerable resources on managing non-game and non-hunted fish and wildlife in the state, and it's a very important part of our program. So again, staying 50,000 foot level, we have commissioned owned or administered lands. Those are lands that you own, either fee title, mostly fee title, and there's some lands within or adjacent to your fee title lands that is BLM, Forest Service, state, in some areas Bureau of Reclamation lands. But in terms of commissioned wildlife habitat management areas, you have about 450,000 acres in the state that you manage for fish and wildlife and public access for hunting and fishing. In addition to those lands, you also own easements and some fee title for public access areas, which primarily focus on fishing. Many of those easements were negotiated in the early 60s, and some of those include waterfowl hunting as well. You'll find as you travel, discuss issues and provide policy direction to the department and travel around the state, you'll find that we have a lot of public use. They're very popular public access areas, and your WHMAs are very popular areas. And for example, in Star Valley, if you look at the Salt River, you have 20 plus public access areas on that portion of the Salt. Those were negotiated with pretty much a handshake. There's a formal document now, but those were negotiated back in the 60s. And they're priceless, and they're wonderful, wonderful areas that you all provide for fishing, and that's the case for many rivers in the state.
Hey, John.
Yes, sir.
So one thing that I think is important here, if you can go back a slide. Maybe if our IT expert can get us back there. Good job, Scott. So John is exactly right. The statute he refers to here does provide that the commission is charged with managing all wildlife. However, there is also a statute that gives management of those animals classified as predatory animals to the Department of Ag. And that's very important for this commission to realize, because essentially what it means is you don't have a responsibility, nor really an expectation by the public to do anything with coyotes, as an example. They're defined by Wyoming statute as predatory animals. The other part that's interesting about that particular issue is that we have two different species that have dual classifications depending on where they're located. So the gray wolf is probably the most common one. They have a dual status, and 85% of the state, the gray wolf is designated as a predatory animal. And then in the very northwest corner of the state, they're designated as trophy game. So the commission has a responsibility in the northwest part of the state to manage them with seasons and bag limits and licenses. And in the rest of the state, the commission does not have a responsibility to manage them. The other one is a wild bison. Bison are defined in Wyoming as either livestock or as wild bison, depending on where they're at. So you'll see that bison doesn't fall into the statutes, into the statutory definition of big game. It's all by itself. It's off to the side and on its own, so it doesn't count as big game. We have seasons for them in that part of the state, in the northwest part of the state, but they're definitely a different legal definition than all the other wildlife in the state. Go ahead. Yep.
I have a question.
Yep.
So, how about when we get to migratory animals, birds, that are under federal protection? Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife give the state primacy to manage those species, or do we worry about those, or how does that work?
Mr. President, Commissioner, we do worry about those, and we have a shared jurisdiction, shared management authority for those migratory species, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does have a lead federal legal responsibility and trust responsibility to manage those. You want to add?
Yeah, so the one thing that those that are under Wyoming statute that are defined as migratory game birds, those that we hunt, geese as an example, have the way that shared management responsibility works is that the department participates in the flyways, and there's 4 flyways in the country, and so our designee to the Central Flyway Council is Scott Smith. He will participate with that group with other states and determine kind of some outside sideboards, regulatory framework that then the commission can operate within to set seasons for migratory game birds.
Okay.
Sure. So yeah, Fish and Wildlife Service basically sets up, I guess, the broad framework, and then within the Flyway Council, each state then can tailor, say, season lengths, splits, and bag limits specifically for the state within concurrence of the Flyway. So while there's a framework that we have to work within, they do defer to the state with a lot of flexibility on how we administer that.
All right. I never knew how that process. Who set the bag limit on a goose? I mean, who does that?
Right.
Do we get to
Yeah, the
participate in
commission
that,
does.
or
So we would bring that in front of the commission
Great.
for approval.
Okay.
But there's been a lot of additional steps with waterfowl outside of our state public process. We also have to work with other states within the Flyway system and the Fish and Wildlife Service when it comes to that. And as Brian said, Wyoming, we have Central Flyway, which probably takes up 3/4 of the state, and the Pacific Flyway over in the western slice there. That Doug Brimmeyer represents our agency on.
Okay, thank you.
And I do not know what
The other thing too on that's important to note is that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act covers both species that are hunted and those that are not. So if they're not a hunted species and they're federally protected, like the raven as an example, the commission doesn't have the authority to go and set a season on ravens. That's not included. They're protected and regulated and managed by the federal government, Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and continue, as you can see, our PowerPoint's down, but that's all right. So we'll just keep going, and y'all can maybe get it fixed whenever. I'm still just giving you an overview of some of your assets and some of the areas that you own and administer in the state. There are 22 feed grounds plus the National Elk Refuge. I guess we're back up and running. I handed out this PowerPoint, by the way, and we're going to give you lots of hard copies today of material and PowerPoints. You can recycle those at the end of the day. You can keep them. Primarily, it's just to make notes. So, again, if you make some notes on some things you want to discuss a little bit later as a group, that might be productive too. We have 10 fish hatcheries and rearing stations, 3 rearing stations and 7 fish hatcheries throughout the state, 2 bird farms, 1 in Sheridan, 1 near Torrington. In terms of laboratories, we have you have a game and fish lab, a wildlife forensic and fish pathology lab in Laramie. That office is the new building, if you've seen it in Laramie, that we recently built. That's a combination now, not just a lab, but a laboratory and regional office in Laramie. We also have our veterinary services, which is in our wildlife division, has a lab at the State Vet Lab in Laramie. And wildlife veterinary services also has, in terms of Wildlife Research Center, the Tom Thorne Beth Williams Wildlife Research Center in Seville, and our Wildlife Health Lab at the State Vet Lab. So, any questions? Feed grounds. I covered feed grounds. We have 22 feed grounds, and then you have the National Elk Refuge too. One more. Okay, our headquarters is in Cheyenne, as I think you know. You have 8 regional offices throughout the state, and here's their locations if you aren't familiar with those. And then any of these regional offices, and also the other previous slide where I was going over the feed grounds, the public access areas, wildlife habitat management areas, whatever the case may be, our research center, laboratories. You want to go see those areas, please give us a call, and we will take time to make sure you have somebody with you that can answer questions and take you to those facilities. You don't need to. I'm not talking and describing this because we want to be there out of the director's office if you're there. I'm just wanting to help you. If you need help from us, you call us, and we'll get you into those facilities or wildlife habitat management areas. And if it's often good to have the local regional folks there with you wherever it is you go, just to get the the most recent information and priorities and what's going on in that particular area. We have, again, staying big picture here, we have not increased the number of full-time employees in this department for many, many, many years. Certainly since I've been here, and I think even 10 plus years before I even got here with the department. Our positions, full-time positions, have stayed pretty steady during the last many years, which says a lot about our employees. We're definitely not doing less work, that's for sure. But we are not increasing the number of employees. This 374 was back in January. As you see, we're already back up to about 398 full-time positions in the department. We can go as high as 400. We do have a cap. That cap has some flexibility in it, but would require some work with the commission and the governor's office to get that cap increased. Okay, we're going to move into some of the priorities and initiatives, big picture for the director's office and some of the positions in the director's office. And this is when Scott Smith's going to come up and take over from here, and we'll kind of team up as we go through here.
Yeah, thanks, John. So, yeah, we'll give you the director's office kind of 30,000-foot view, but I can't overemphasize. The director's office is here for the commission to utilize. We're your resource to help in any way we can. So anytime questions, concerns come up, the three of us are available 24/7, and encourage you to reach out at any time. So as you can see here, just some overarching initiatives or direction. Obviously, as David pointed out, Director's Office assists in implementing the Commission's policies and state policies. We establish and direct department programs, giving the overall department direction going forward. We play a large role in coordination of the variety of activities and programs the department engages in. You'll hear later this afternoon the allocating of resources, the department's, the Commission's budget that we will then allocate to our various divisions and programs. And then it's also been mentioned, a lot of this is going to be repetitive, but Brian, John, and I do a lot of coordination, communication, not only with the Commission, but the Governor's Office, the Chief of Staff, his senior policy advisors, his environmental policy staff. It's a daily occurrence, just to make sure that our agency is in lockstep, or at least informs the Governor's Office on our initiatives and programs and what we're trying to achieve. There's a lot of coordination with our Governor's Office, and we've been quite blessed over the years to have just a really supportive and solid governor and his support staff. So it's been really good. And then finally, coordinating and interacting with our other partners. Derek's here today representing his organization. We do a lot of non-government organization outreach. We work, at the local levels with municipalities, county commissioners, our sister agencies. We do a lot of work, DOT, Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Quality, just on and on and on. A lot of various outreach and coordination with groups. So real quick, just wanted to go through kind of the positions. John did a really good job of kind of laying the groundwork already, but we'll just step real quickly through the various positions in the director's office. Oh, I skipped over the priorities. So here's just a bulleted list of some of the priorities we're working on. You'll hear more about this not only with the budget that's going to be presented to you, and the new commissioners I'll get you. I brought a copy of our strategic plan. Over the last year, we've been working with the public and our employees to come up with a 5-year strategic plan, something that we've been lacking as an agency. We've had fiscal plans, obviously, to direct how we spend money, but we've really never had that forward-looking visionary kind of document. We have that in hand now, and this will be the first fiscal year we've actually put money to implement the priorities that the public told us they would like to see us either enhance that we're already doing or take on new some new projects. So we'll be going over that as far as the budget later in this afternoon with this budget sub-team, and then tomorrow with the formal budget. Short-term and long-term funding, always a high priority for the director's office, making sure that we work closely with our legislature anytime funding needs come about. Organizational effectiveness and efficiencies kind of ties into why we felt a strategic plan, that visionary look forward was important to maintain the organization, not only the funding, but how we're structured and how we can be most efficient with the use of the sportsman's dollars. Internal and external communications, obviously, if we can't communicate, we're failing on many fronts. So, without saying, a very high priority for director's office and all of our programs throughout the agency. And then the last two are kind of at the core of our agency's mission: management and conservation of all of Wyoming's fish and wildlife, and to provide that opportunity for outdoor activities whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive. Those types of endeavors are very important to the director office and the agency, and we spend a lot of time making sure we can address the public's desires in those among those categories as well. Okay, Johnny, now we can go into the position by position. So you heard our director speak already this morning, but you know, he's the boss. He leads our agency. He provides us that critical leadership as the chief administrator, and provides that overall general supervision of activities, functions, and oversight of employees. And as you've already heard, he's under the direction and supervision of not only the commission, but being appointed and serving on the governor's cabinet. Then we have the two deputy directors, and we appropriately skipped over the internal deputy director, and we'll go right to the external. Oh, okay. And
Brian, do you want to add anything to the director?
sorry, yeah,
No, it's you got covered well. Yep.
kind of speeding right through this. So John is one of the two deputy directors. He's an avid goose hunter, so this slide is very, very appropriate. Lives and breathes goose hunting. And here's just a list of everything, or not everything, some of the highlights Johnny covers. Would you like to?
No, I think that's it. I think, and again, you know, we talked about some of these things in the director's office earlier, and then I talked a little bit about the internal and external operations. Again, the model we have is our director's office spends time on all of these. So there's not a decision made on any of these things up here without Scott and Director Nesbitt. So, but on paper, the director has asked, put a responsibility on me for your budget. So the budget that you'll see tomorrow, and we'll be asking for your preliminary approval. I work on with our Chief Fiscal Officer, Meredith Wood, and Melissa's here to talk about our fiscal and our budget issues, and you'll hear from them also later today. Every contract, every agreement, any document that the department is executing on your behalf comes across my desk. And I see every one of those, whether they're $5 or $5 million. I spent a lot of time working with Sheridan and with our other staff in the director's office, just managing the director's office. And I also spent a lot of time with Sheridan working with all of you on commission meetings. You have questions, concerns, agenda items, anything that you want to do at the commission meeting, you call us, and certainly call me, call Scott or Brian, and we'll make sure we get that happen. Don't ever hesitate to call us. And for Brian and Scott and I, that means 24/7, anytime. I also have the pleasure of managing and being on most internal working groups. We have several internal working groups right now that spend a lot of time on things from budget and IT resources to property rights. And I try to meet with our team leaders and division chiefs on those particular working groups on a weekly basis. Now to our external operations.
Okay. Well, like Johnny said, you know, on paper we do have specific assignments, but it is definitely a team approach. I do a lot of collaboration with not only the governor's office, but the legislature. On Friday, I'll give you a brief overview of the legislation from this last session that directly affects both the department and commission. But we coordinate, interact with the legislature tours year-round. It's not just a 40-day session and then it goes away. It's a year-long endeavor. Obviously, with half of the land mass in our state under federal management, there's a lot of coordination that takes place with BLM and Forest Service and other resource management agencies. NRCS is another great example. Bureau of Reclamation on our fisheries work. So there's a lot of federal coordination that goes on as well. And then I mentioned before our sister agencies and local governments, county commissions, all play a very key part in how we manage wildlife in our state, and as well as NGOs, industry. We work a lot with not only individual producers, oil and gas, or mining or whatnot, but Petroleum Association of Wyoming. We work with quite regularly. Again, you'll hear more about migration corridors this meeting and many meetings to come. There's a lot of coordinations ongoing with not only the environmental aspect interests, but the producers, oil and gas producers as well. And then John mentioned before, so habitat protection, we have a program, and I'll highlight that in a little bit, but that's under the director's office, direct supervision too. A lot of what they work on influences policy and implementing policy of the department, and it's very appropriate that they have a straight direct line to the director's office in that regard. So, our senior policy and planning analyst, Jessica Vendegna. This is a new position that was created a couple months ago, and John mentioned this earlier. Obviously, this position coordinates all the department planning. She was and works with Sheridan as far as administrative support of the director's office, and she was actively involved in our strategic planning, helping me and the communications director with all things strategic planning to get that document finalized and implemented. So she just provides a huge administrative support for our office. And then when it comes to the legislature, I coordinate a lot of the testimony and who's going to attend what committee meeting. But Jessica, in her position, she's the one that serves as a key liaison internally to keep me on track and help everybody efficiently keep up with the hectic schedule during legislature and all those associated tasks. And as previously mentioned, Sheridan Todd is our executive assistant. Those of you that have been on the commission now for a few years have a great appreciation for everything Sheridan does to support the commission. She's your go-to person for all things logistic and for meetings and arrangements, and she's a great resource.
So Scott, one thing on that is Sheridan's the primary point of contact for the commission on those kind of things, but Jessica's her backup in case she's on vacation or not available for some other reason. So
we have a planning coordinator in the director's office as well, Glenn Pauley. He also sits in overall department planning, coordinating of that, and he prepares our big annual reports, whether it's to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have to do an annual report every year, and he also is very integral in our State Wildlife Action Plan, which this State Wildlife Action Plan helps us manage our non-game species, everything that we don't hunt and fish, which numbers in the hundreds throughout our state. So very important plan that we constantly have to keep updated, to provide direction to the department on how we're going to keep common species common. Our goal to prevent any listing of those species, so high priority in the agency. John already introduced Corey. You can see here Corey's staff is made up of Kate Grant. She's our human resource specialist, and Carolyn Weinberger, our payroll specialist. So basically, our HR staff provides the human resource services to the entire department. So making sure we're in compliance with not only state but federal personnel regulations, offering employee assistance when needed, and also one of Corey's charges will be assisting in the department's leadership development program. You'll see that in the strategic plan implementation. We've had a leadership development program in years past. Due to budget constraints, we had to drop it for a while, and we're reinitiating that. We hope to reinitiate that starting with FY20. John's been working with a third-party contractor to get this up and rolling, and we're quite excited to get that program back on the books and provide that opportunity to our employees for leadership development opportunities. And then finally, Corey and his staff also provide succession planning for the entire agency. And with that, you've already met and heard from our Assistant Attorney General, David DeWald. Here's just a bulleted list of many of the things that he already covered, everything from regulatory counsel to policy and real estate, litigation prevention, obviously a huge part of his workload. He works a lot on grants and contracts to make sure we're legal in those realms. And you can see the list goes on and on. Key individual that supports not only the director's office, but the entire agency.
One thing that's important too, David's our primary guy on all things legal, but there is some other assistance we get at times from other attorneys in the Attorney General's office. With Endangered Species Act is probably one that there's kind of a team of lawyers that work on those issues. David's the lead, but there's others that help him. And then also on personnel matters, there's another attorney that we typically work with on personnel stuff. David doesn't do any of our legal work on personnel matters. So.
And then the last program within the director's office, the Habitat Protection Program I mentioned earlier. Their major tasks are review and evaluate proposed actions, whether it's a federal project on BLM or Forest Service land, or a state WYDOT project. They're the team that evaluates those projects based on not only the merits of the project, but what impacts it may or may not have to our wildlife resources throughout the state. They work directly with the governor's office on the core area sage grouse strategy, the governor's executive order. Our agency has been asked to facilitate the implementation of that core area strategy. So the HPP staff does a lot of the technical support of the governor's strategy. Being a game bird, the sage grouse, it is appropriate that we at least have that technical expertise that we can provide back to the governor's office on the core area strategy. And while this is a small group of biologists that work for the agency, there's 6 total positions, or 6 total biologists in this branch. 5 of them are in Cheyenne, 1's located in Casper. But their duties are outreach to the entire agency on all of the districts, the 8 regional offices. So there's a lot of outreach that goes on with our field personnel and the variety of industries that are out, scattered around the state, that proposing various projects that we work on a day-to-day basis. So that kind of wraps up the director's office overview. And again, we're a resource for the commission, and please feel free to rely on us heavily.
So, Mr. President, members of the commission, we're doing good on time. Before we move on, questions, just any discussion you want to have about anything you've heard so far? Director's office, from David DeWald, anything, questions, issues? We can take a break when you want. It's your call. We got an overview of the land acquisition program, and then lunch. That's what we've got so far on the schedule.
Let's take a 10-minute break if we can.
Want a break?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll take 10 minutes.
sponsors, so they really promote this thing.
lands administration works on all our property rights. You have one policy. We move forward on acquisitions of fee title and less than fee title, easements, conservation easements, public access projects, and acquiring lands and facilities, houses for employees, all pursuant to statute and pursuant to a commission policy. So I'm going to give you, as Sean comes up here and starts to talk to you, I'm going to give you a policy that you don't necessarily need to go through today, but that is the policy we follow for every project that we bring to the commission. It goes through the process that's explained in these policy guidelines. And then on property rights, very complicated projects often take a long, long time. Many of you have worked on acquisition projects and purchasing land or other facilities and things like that. They take a lot of time, and they're always full of surprises. And so we'll spend a lot of time working with you on these projects. And also, I would say, based on my experience working with commissions, every commission's different in terms of how much information they want, how many times they want to hear it, whether they want to go visit these sites when we before we bring them to you. And so I would just tell you that, having said that, we are open to, when you look at this commission policy, we are open to proceeding with property rights in any fashion that you want us to proceed with those, okay? So we want to take time with you. We want to provide enough information for you. We'll have discussions in between commission meetings all the time about these projects just to keep you in the loop and engaged. And again, some of these will require discussions in executive session. So I'm going to give you that policy, not to overload you with material. You can shove it in your bag, but at some point take a look at that and be aware that that's the process that we follow. And it also has some flexibility built into it to make changes based on different commissions. So with that, Sean.
Good morning, Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Nesbitt. As Deputy Director Kennedy said, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the lands branch, some property rights terminology, and then on to the nomination process for lands acquisition projects, and ultimately Policy 7J, which was just handed out to you a moment ago. As stated previously in the Deputy Director's presentation, the Commission owns and or manages over 450,000 acres across the entire state of Wyoming. And the lands branch consists of just myself, Darren Kramer, who's the lands coordinator out of Cheyenne, covers the Laramie, Casper, Sheridan, Green River regions, and then Brian Rognan, who's also the lands coordinator that works out of our Lander office, and he covers the Lander, Cody, Jackson, and Pinedale regions. I'd like to note that myself and both members of my staff are all certified appraisers. I'm a certified general as well as Darren Kramer, and Brian Rognan is a certified residential appraiser. This is helpful in that when we do a lot of projects and there's an appraisal component, it gives us the ability to review those appraisals in-house as opposed to having to hire a third party to do that. So the role of the lands branch, it's to facilitate the administration of commission-owned lands and property rights, including acquisitions and disposals. We also keep an inventory of real property right records for all administrative facilities, lands, and waters acquired or administered by the commission. And we also keep an accounts payable system for all recurring payments for those property rights. So what are property rights? Well, when we speak in terms of property rights with the commission, it's generally going to be, the simple earth surface, the air above and the ground below, as well as all the appurtenance affixed there too. And then real property rights, and I'm sure you've all heard the term the bundle of rights, which is a good description of all the interests and benefits and rights inherent to ownership of real property. Most of the projects we'll be presenting to you that have an acquisition component will have a fee title project associated with them, where we'll be asking to acquire a property or dispose of a property in fee title. So the commission owns property in fee title on most of the 39 wildlife habitat management areas and in some of the 200 public access areas that we hold. The one that comes to mind where we don't have fee title property on a WHMA is San Mesa, which is located between Riverton and Shoshone, which is almost 18,000 acres of mostly public land that we manage. So again, the commission owns and or manages approximately 450,000 acres. These acres are used for habitat and public access, and they're located throughout the entire state. We also hold a number of conservation easements, and conservation easements are basically designed to prevent habitat destruction or prevents further subdivision or future subdivision while retaining an agricultural component. We do hold a number of those, and yes, we hold currently 30 conservation easements. 12 of those were through a purchase, 15 were donated, and 3 were retained through land exchanges or sales, and 10 of those allow public access. So not every conservation easement that we hold or will hold in the future always has a public access component, although we do strive to have that included when the opportunity arises. A lot of the projects that we'll bring to you for your approval will be for an easement of some type or another. Good example of that is we've just proceeded with 2 transmission line easements that traverse the Red Rim Daily WHMA. Those transmission lines required right-of-way easements for those, and we'll deal with those types of requests and projects on a regular basis. And as stated previously, we hold 200 public access areas, and the majority of those are for public hunting and fishing, the majority of which are actually for fishing. Along the western side of the state is where the majority of those are located across the river accesses there. Those include float access sites, boat ramps, and parking areas that are associated with those areas. We do a lot of leases, mainly with the Office of State Lands and Investments. Of the 39 wildlife habitat management areas that we have, there's a number of those that have state land sections included in those boundaries, and we, as the commission, hold those leases. We pay for those on an annual basis. The Lands Branch does all of the property right agreements for the commission. So we do contracts, purchase agreements, easements, MOAs, MOUs, any of those types of agreements come through the Lands Branch program and ultimately through the AG review process before they're finalized. And as John stated, all these agreements go through his desk or his office before they're ultimately approved and signed off on. And with regard to MOAs and cooperative agreements and MOUs, those are typically interagency agreements between the commission and, say, the Bureau of Land Management or another federal agency or state agency, where we cooperatively agree to do some type of management action on a piece of property. Special use permits are something that will occasionally be brought to the commission. We hold special use permits on primarily Forest Service property for patrol cabins and feed grounds and things like that. But we also have our own special use permits that we grant on an occasional basis to entities for activities that don't necessarily align themselves with the purpose of the acquisition of that particular WHMA, but don't impede the the purpose of that acquisition, so to speak. So we, as I stated, the commission holds special use permits on public lands, mainly through the BLM and the Forest Service for roads, hatcheries, patrol cabins, wildlife fences, test plots, and habitat enhancements. And then we do issue special use permits on an occasional basis. Most of these are for less than a year, so the commission is not typically involved with less than a year special use permit. If those exceed, or those requests exceed a year in term, they will be brought before the commission for the policy guidelines for approval. So as you can imagine, as the commission holds property, we also hold water rights across the state, and these are used for water wells, irrigation, reservoirs, and in-stream flow. And then here's just kind of a brief summary of what the commission holds. There's approximately 166,500 acres in fee title, with the remainder of 283,500 in non-fee title, and those are the state land leases and BLM that we've been referencing. That includes 47,700 acres of lake, and then stream miles at 372. So a fairly significant amount of property that the commission manages across the state. So this is the main thing to consider the commission. There's a process that's outlined in the policy guidelines for the acquisition and disposal of property. Mainly an internal process that takes place before it ever reaches the commission. The first step in the process is the nomination. The nomination of a project can be brought to the department by a member of the public. It can be an employee. It can be a commissioner. But that nomination process is then reviewed at a regional level, typically through what we call our regional leadership team. And that's usually composed of employees from the 4 different divisions, or well, the 3 different divisions, mainly services, wildlife, and fish. If the project is approved at that level, then it moves on to the property rights team. And the property rights team consists of executive staff membership, and they review those projects and ultimately decide on whether those will get moved forward to the commission for authorization to proceed. So the commission process on lands projects is typically a 2-step process. The first one would be an authorization to proceed component, and that would give us the ability to negotiate on purchase price or something to that effect. We will then order an appraisal if necessary, do all the due diligence, including title research, notices to the public if necessary, and all those components after that authorization to proceed. Then those documents, once they're created, they will go through the Attorney General's review process, which isn't typically through David. It's actually through their contract people downtown. The one I typically work with is Assistant AG Tyler Renner. So he reviews most of our documents before they ever get signed by John Kennedy on behalf of the commission or the other party. Most of those are always contingent upon commission approval, final commission approval, and so that second step process is we'll then bring that project to you guys for that final approval, and then we will complete that transaction, whatever it may be. And then all of that process is guided by the policy that was just given to you. And there's 5 major components of that policy. The first one is market value, and that's significant in that when we do some type of a property transaction, we are guided by that policy to either, we can't pay over market value based on that policy, nor can we sell property for less than market value based on that policy. So the appraisal component of that is important. This also guides the acquisition and disposal of administrative facilities. That's more of a department process, but we can keep the commission informed along the way. Also talks about how we go about acquiring and disposing of lands and waters that the commission would or does hold. Renewals are something that you'll see on a regular basis. We do have fairly long-term agreements with landowners for public access in a lot of instances, say for 10 years. So we'll be bringing those to the commission on a regular basis for approval based on the monetary exchange, the location, and the need for the public to have that access area. And then this also guides our policy regarding temporary use acquisitions. And those can be anything from the state land leases that we talked about to parking areas or boat ramps that are located on BLM or BOR or other federal property.
So one thing I just want to mention here is we have added, just informally on behalf of the director's office, we've modified this a little bit to involve you early on projects that are going to be, that we feel have some maybe some red flags, are going to be contentious, will have significant public opinion and concern or support if they're good or bad. We will come to you, and those projects that are in your district, we'll actually engage you, and if you want to go out on the ground and look at those projects, we'd love to have you come out and do that, the local commissioner, and that way by the time it comes to the commission, you have that input from a commissioner, and that we found that to be really, really beneficial. So we'll do that, and you just let us know if that's something you don't want to be involved in, and you don't need to be, but we're going to want to engage you and get you out on the ground and looking at some of these projects. The other thing is, you're going to get calls. You'll get calls from your constituents in your districts about these projects, guaranteed. And it has been very productive for us to go and meet with those constituents with the commissioner. Commissioner Crank can speak on behalf of this. We have, since he's been on the commission, and prior to that we had commissioners, but with Commissioner Crank, we've gone out and sat down with folks that are proposing to sell or buy or have properties next to your WHMAs, and sit down and resolve issues. They appreciate having involvement by the commission. We do, and so I just would throw that out, that you'll get engaged in some of these projects, and we hope that you're okay with that. Okay.
Thank you. So when we refer to administrative facilities, I think the best example of that is game warden stations. So we, on a regular basis, will upgrade or purchase new game warden stations as needed. But these also include our regional offices, hatcheries, any of the really department administered property are considered administrative facilities. We'll have renewals that I spoke about earlier, temporary or minor uses. So when we talk about those temporary or minor uses, the commissioner for each region will be informed on those temporary or minor uses, and then that commissioner can decide whether to bring that forth for a full commission vote or meeting, or simply move forward with it at that point. So right now, the lands branch property rights priorities have been to work on projects that have a public access component, conservation easements with public access, and then lands adjacent to commission-owned lands, including inholdings. So there are a few WHMAs where we've got some other private land within the overall units that we keep a fairly steady eye on to see if they ever come up for sale, and then we'll oftentimes bring those before the commission for a potential purchase opportunity.
Quick comment. So, as Sean talked about conservation easements and public access earlier, just to make this clear, that may be confusing to you because conservation easements are not access projects by definition. They're the purchase and acquisition of development rights. on properties. Where the public access comes in is that many times, since we're sitting at the table with these landowners, they want to do a conservation easement, we'll ask for access, or we'll try to work with them on whatever access we can get for the public. But normally, almost all conservation easements by other entities in the country do not involve public access. And many of your conservation easements don't involve public access. So we will continue, and that'll be based on your direction. We've had commissions that have not supported conservation easements unless they have public access, and you just need to know that that's a deal breaker can be a deal breaker for some landowners. But we'll try to do that. But there's other avenues to work on public access besides a conservation easement. But in the most part, conservation easements are the acquisition, and it's wildlife habitat, the protection of wildlife habitat in perpetuity by limiting or restricting development rights.
And that's basically a general overview of the lands program. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have at this time. Like I said, we'll definitely have projects at nearly every commission meeting for your review and comments. So. Thank you.
Okay, we'll check on lunch. Let's see, what did we do? Yeah, we took a break here in the schedule for lunch. So we've got salad and soup out, I think it's out in this hallway over here. We can take our time. This is all what you all want to do. But if you want, we can come back in. We have a video we think you'll enjoy at some point. That video, I think, is 15 or 20 minutes, if I recall. So we have a little bit more time allocated. And then at about 1:30, when you're ready to roll, we'll get back into it, and we'll start back with the funding model and talk about your budget a little bit. Does that sound okay with you? So we'll break for lunch.
Hey, John, I got a quick question for you, and I may have missed it in my absence, but on the 450,000 acres that we own and or manage, do you have a breakdown of that? How much we own versus what we manage?
We do, and that slide was up. You have a breakdown off the top of your head?
Yeah, I knew I missed it.
Nope, that's okay. Yeah. And we have, these guys maintain a really good database and a tracking process, and we can print this information out for you, even by district. So if the commissioner wants to know the lands, the access, the WHMAs, public access areas, all that stuff by district, you just let us know. We also have management plans developed for every one of your wildlife habitat management areas, and we intend to get that to every commissioner for those wildlife habitat management areas that are within your district. So the new commissioners be looking for that. I think you've got a slide, or you can just tell them. Do you have a slide?
I do, but I can tell them too. The fee title is 166,500. So that's what we hold deeded, and then the leased or managed is 283,500.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Good job. So do you want to break for lunch, Ed?
With that, you good with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.